everybody. It's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network, joining you from Holland-filled Washington. Forgive me if I sound a little rough today. The allergies are kicking in. Thank you all for being with us for today's webinar. We have a lot of you. There's over 400 folks who've joined us for this. Today's webinar is Timing It Right, Resurfacing Content to Maximize Engagement. And this is a really big idea we're excited to bring to you. We're going to be joined to share this by Jason Tomassini. He's the Associate Director of Editorial at Atlantic 57. You may know them formally as Atlantic Media Strategies, and if you've been to ComNet in the past, you know that we are big fans. They're some of the smartest people we know. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, put simply, here's a little data point that I think inspires all of this, which is the Atlantic magazine, which has been around since 1857, has managed to survive at a time when we've seen the demise of lots of other big weekly magazines, things like Newsweek and Time, or in many cases shadows of their former selves. But the Atlantic has thrived in the digital age, and partly because I think it's become a learning organization. They've always been willing to look to the future and challenge themselves to be innovative, but what they're learning actually is that their past is equally important. About 57% of the Atlantic's online traffic in any given month shows up from stories that were published in the past, content that's not new, which is a pretty remarkable thing for all of us who are constantly hearing, what's the next thing? Let's put that thing out that we just got. That report's got to be ready. We're publishing this tomorrow. And talking about editorial calendars, the Atlantic's big idea is that your editorial calendar is probably wonderful and a good and worthy thing to be spending a lot of time on, but it may turn out that the thing that you published last May is in fact salient, relevant, and useful to people today. And it's worth thinking about ways to bring that back into your work to ensure that what you're doing is in fact useful, because I think that's the key rule in today's digital age is you can't just make it and hope the audience finds it. It's got to be useful and of the moment that they're in. Think about if you were sitting in a hospital. I don't know if you watch those little doc dramas, but if the doctor asks for a scalpel, the nurse hands him a wrench. I don't know. Obviously, I haven't watched one of these things in a while. Suffice to say, it ain't going to go well. So it's really critical that when your audience is asking for some help, that you deliver what they want and what they need, and not necessarily what you want to give them. So that's what we're going to be talking about. The next hour, we're going to cover why resurfacing can be a valuable part of your editorial and distribution strategy, how social listening can help your organization enter ongoing conversations with audiences. And this is critical, right? Listening is always the first order of communications, but it's really critical. You want to be able to meet your audience where they are. You have to understand where they're coming from. And then finally, how to keep a running list of content to resurface at the right moment, because it's great if you know it's in your archives, but if your team and there's no structure in place to help you access and take advantage of that stuff, well, you're probably behind the eight ball. All right, a couple logistical items before we get underway. As we always do, we'll be taking questions throughout the presentation, so if you're feeling anxious, just wait. I promise we will get to a Q&A section. You can use the chat box to send your questions in. If you're on the webinar technology, that's down in the lower left-hand corner. Just type them in there, and we will get to as many of them as we can. You can also engage with us on Twitter, that fancy thing if you haven't used it before. You can use the hashtag ComNetLive, and here I probably better spell it out for you guys. It's COMNETLIVE. We'll be taking your questions and comments there, and many of you are always kind enough to share what you think are the big takeaways with your colleagues, so please do so. We're always grateful to see that. And as always, this webinar is going to be recorded. In fact, they're recording my voice right now. We'll be posting it up online at comnetwork.org for free replays, and also on our brand new YouTube channel. You'll be able to find it there fairly soon. The next couple of days we'll post it up. All right, I've yacked at you enough. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand it off to the brilliant and smart Jason Tomassini.
Awesome.
Jason.
Thanks a lot, Sean, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Really excited about this. I'm going to speak and project loudly because we're coming to you very live from downtown Washington, D.C. And
yeah, Jason's got a little bit of a drummer behind him.
That are piping through the window here, but I think we should be okay today. Awesome. So Sean mentioned the presentation today is called Timing It Right, Resurfacing Content at the Right Moment. And as you mentioned, a big part of the concept behind this is that with the frenzy and chaos of the current media landscape, just a linear form of publishing, just finishing your content, publishing it, and forgetting about it, is really doing a disservice to your work and your potential engagement for your audiences. And so what we're going to bring today is some lessons that we've learned from both The Atlantic, which we are a part of, and also some of our client work through Atlantic 57 that's really focused on how you can keep track and monitor the different conversations that are happening around your core issues. And then as Sean mentioned, use not only your new content, but your most relevant archival content to match those different moments and conversations. First, we're going to just do a quick overview of who we are. As Sean mentioned, Atlantic 57 is the consulting and creative division of The Atlantic. You may know us by our former name, Atlantic Media Strategies. For anyone who's wondering, the 57 has nothing to do with ketchup. The Atlantic was founded in 1857, and so we feel like the new brand is representative of what we're really trying to do through our work, which has helped our clients own their big ideas and transform for a modern world using all the lessons that we can bring from the Atlantic's history going all the way back to 1857. This, I think, is really at our core what we try to do. We're born out of the Atlantic's own transformation from a legacy magazine to a multi-platform pioneer. And I think the best summary of this comes from our current president, Bob Cohn, which is for years the Atlantic was a magazine, and then it became an idea. And so for years the Atlantic was defined by the way that it was delivered to people, and when those delivery methods became much more varied, much more complex, it was really important for us to understand what is the idea behind our brand and how do we distribute that through not just a magazine, but all of the different platforms that are available to us in reaching audiences. And so that will inform a small part of what we're going to talk about today. So what can you expect for us to cover? Sean covered on a few of these things, how timing can be a key factor for engaging your audiences, how listening to the conversations around your issues can really be as critical as pushing your content out, again, being able to resurface content from your archives, and also to be able to actually systematize this work and keep some kind of list and workflow that helps you do this more regularly and efficiently, and so it doesn't feel like some added thing that you have to do in your already busy life. And so we're going to take a little bit of a context. Why are we talking about this today? And we really feel that the root problem right now in media and communications and digital is that audiences are harder to attract and retain than ever before. So even if you're able to attract audiences through something that they find compelling, the nature of consumption and interaction with content is so fleeting that it becomes even harder to then retain them. And so we see a lot of organizations that might sacrifice their substance, sacrifice their values to attract audiences, but then because there's no depth there, they're not able to retain them. And so, being able to do both is really critical to be successful today. And so some questions that we see our clients really facing, how do you appeal to younger, broader, more influential audiences? How do you tell stories that resonate for more than a few seconds? How do you get your ideas and information to the audiences who will value it? And I think another key part of that is how do you define the audiences that will value information? And how do you make sure that you're not narrowcasting what you do? And also, how do you understand what resonates and extend your influence? So how do you, as Sean mentioned, become a learning organization that iterates over time? And so what we found is that to succeed, you really have to relentlessly focus on your audience, the people who read, follow, share, and value you. And that might seem obvious to a lot of communicators and people in the communications network who are very sophisticated about this kind of thing. But it can also be hard. It can be easy to fall back into a trap that we see a lot of organizations fall back into, which is really thinking from an institutional perspective, an institutional voice, and serving the institutional priorities first. And what we found working in a media organization is that it's really critical to focus on your audience's priorities and needs first, and how can your institution help serve that. And so one way that we found organizations being successful in doing this is to enter the growth editor. And so the growth editor is a position that we found has been really effective in media organizations, and we're starting to see that role become more prevalent in nonprofit organizations. The growth editor can be a single person, and that role is equal parts social media strategist, journalist, and analyst. And what it really does is elevate the role of a social media manager, which has typically been reserved for interns or maybe entry-level positions, and really put it into much more of a strategic function within your communications and marketing teams, and really think about audience growth as a core skill set and a core value to your organization. And so that can take the role of a single person, or it can take the role of a team. And you can also develop an audience growth mindset within your organization, which may take many different forms in terms of the people that you might have on your team. So it can be a social media manager, but you also have to think about, an engagement editor. You also have to think about a campaign strategist. Think about, as you want to develop your audience and engage audiences more deeply, what are the types of people and skill sets that you need to have internally? And so that can be one person, or it can be several people, or it can be a team that is really taking a certain mindset and approach to the work. And you'll see here that there are skill sets that you really need in someone who's doing this kind of work that may, again, transcend what we've typically seen in like the social media manager role. So you have to be analytical and goal-oriented and quantitative. But you also have to be someone who has an editorial and creative mindset. So you have to be fresh, you have to be audience first, you have to be relevant. And so, the challenges that we face in today's media landscape really require the type of people who can take this kind of approach to audience development and communication. And ultimately, by establishing this role or establishing this mindset, it helps you dedicate more time to doing the work that is more and more critical right now, which is actually getting your content to your audiences. So this is an assessment that we've done from talking to people within the Atlantic and its sister properties newsrooms, and also our clients' communications and marketing teams. And you'll see there's a difference between what we've seen in what you call quote-unquote traditional media team and what you would call a modern media team. A traditional media team is spending 30% of their time on planning and maybe 50% of their time on creating content. And so, what are examples of that? The long reports that you might do that undergo several rounds of review, require intensive layout and copy editing, and various teams reviewing and doing a detailed due diligence on all of the work. Some of that's really important. Accuracy is obviously incredibly important. But by the time, in a lot of those efforts, by the time you get to the point where it's actually ready to be published, it's been so overworked that you actually don't have the time or potentially even the interest to do the really important work, which is getting it out to people. And so we found that the actual work of distribution, and then of course the work that's even farther down the road of resurfacing, so going back to the work that you publish and thinking about it in new context, it always gets short shrift. We've heard from tons of clients who say, by the time this big report is finally ready to go, we're so sick of it that we just want to move on to the next thing. And it just pains me because you spent so much time in the planning and creation. Why wouldn't you then spend as much time on actually getting it out to people and make sure that you're maximizing the value of the work that you're doing? So the more modern media teams that we're seeing, it's much more even distribution about how they're spending their time. It might be 20% on planning and 30% on creation, and then equally as much on the distribution and resurfacing. And a couple of things that's important to note here. One is the overall pie stays the same. We're not trying to ask people to do more work here. We're trying to ask people to better prioritize their time, energy, and resources, and also be more efficient in what they do. And so how do you do that? Well, a lot of organizations that we work with, we found they're really reactive, and they don't have processes in place to make the planning and the creation really efficient. And so by setting editorial guidelines, by setting really clear review processes, by having established editorial themes and content narratives that you're going to be focusing on, that helps you prioritize and execute much more quickly, so then you still do have the time for the distribution and resurfacing work that's ultimately going to help your content reach the people that you're trying to reach. And so this modern media team distribution, this is all the internal processes and workflow that you need to do to be successful. And what we'll talk about in the rest of this presentation are some tactics that can help you get to that point. But I think we're going to pause for now because I think we're going to see if there are some initial questions, and then we can continue on with the presentation. Or if not, I can keep going and we can catch up towards the end.
Yeah, why don't I take the moderator's privilege and just sort of start here. So it's
your show. It's your show, Sean.
It's a radical rethinking of how, the chart right there, I wish it was almost a pie chart because I think you could see the expansion. When you go from 5% of your time thinking about resurfacing to 20% of your time, that's extraordinary. And the idea that 15% is spent on distribution, in a traditional shop, and now 30%, so fully 50%, the largest chunk of the pie is on distribution and resurfacing.
Yeah.
How do you actually get from here to there? Because so many folks are sort of stuck, not with any bad intentions, but just they have a model that they've worked within, and it's hard to disrupt yourself sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've found is that the act of quote-unquote promotion, which I think gets conflated with distribution, is thought of as something that is an add-on at the end of a process. And so we've worked with a lot of organizations where the communications team is maybe brought in towards the tail end of a process and are asked, can you get this out to people? And they have no context on how to do it, and they're probably working with limited assets to be able to do that effectively. And so one critical piece of being able to get to that bottom chart is having earlier involvement from the communications team or the people who are managing and setting the strategic direction for your distribution channels, having earlier involvement in the process where they can actually plan and create along with whoever's the primary planner or creator within an organization. And so if you look at what the Atlantic does, this is fairly, you don't have to know the ins and outs of the Atlantic to get how this might work. You're going to have an article, let's say a cover story, and you're going to have a writer, and you're going to have an editor that's responsible for that cover story. But rather than wait until that thing is done to bring in the social or audience growth team in this case, the audience growth team is working with those writers and editors as the story is taking shape to be able to develop a strategy to collect different assets, whether it's images or quotes or excerpts from a narrative, and start to build a plan on how this is going to live on those social channels. And so they're actually working much more in lockstep. And so actually there's probably a different version of this chart where you actually show when are these things happening, and it's not an assembly line. It's happening concurrent with each other.
Right.
Because ultimately we know that's going to make for the best end product and hopefully allow the people who are responsible for getting this stuff out to your audiences enough time to put their strategic skills to work.
So this is actually what you're pointing to, is there's a structural problem in a lot of organizations, which is the comms team, as I often say, sits on a lonely island as an adjunct to what many organizations see as the work. And that could be the leadership team and programmatic teams and maybe folks out in the field, and comms is there as sort of a service provider. Mm-hmm. And you're saying, no, you've got to integrate them in. They have to be a strategic partner because, in fact, they're going to be the distributors. On top of every other value they add, they're going to do a much better job of distributing stuff and understanding when things are relevant and how the audience is going to react to these things. If they're sitting at the table early on.
Also, which organization, I can't think of organizations now where it isn't critical to achieving their mission to actually engage the people that they need to engage to achieve that mission. And so why would you have the people who have a really strong skill set and actually reaching the people you need to achieve your mission, why would you have them sitting in the dark until the very end of that process? And I know we're preaching to the choir here, but it actually does require organizations to think about their processes in a much more concrete and tangible way and how to actually change those things to make it happen. It's enough, you can always talk about how we want to be involved earlier or whatever, but you have to actually put those processes in place to be able to do it. And so I think that this is a goal, to put in front of your organization, what the chart you see on the bottom, and then it's all about how do you actually implement those processes to get there.
Gotcha. All right, let's move ahead.
Cool. So we're going to look at two components of this that I think are really critical to making this actually work. And so one is active listening, riding the social waves that you and others create around your issues. Here's another statistic from theatlantic.com that I think is really interesting, and it shows that audience interest is concentrated and unpredictable, and that timing can make all the difference. So this one's a little hard to explain, so bear with me. So this shows on the left the percentage of articles written in the history of the Atlantic, and the blue band is 1% of those articles. On the right, it's the percentage of site traffic in a given month. And so 1% of the historical articles from theatlantic.com actually account for 46% of the traffic. And so what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that there's certain articles, home runs, that are just really driving traffic and ongoing interest and engagement with the site. And then there's 54% that are in the bottom 99%. And it's not to say that those are failures, but but those are articles that along the way you're going to produce with the best intentions, but they're not always going to gain the same traction. And so it's really important to learn from each side of that chart on the right. It's really important to learn from what worked of the articles that gained the most attention, and also what didn't quite work of the articles that fall into the rest. But ultimately, you're never going to be able to truly predict what's going to be successful and what's not. What's more important is that you're actively learning about what's successful and what's not. And one way that you can do that is through social listening, which we think is more than just tracking trends or being creepy like Cambridge Analytica, and it's more about actually thinking about what your audiences care about and how you can react to that. And so it really requires the analysis of the online world around your organization and your issues, and also your networks. And what it can help you do is really leverage some of that knowledge to make sure that you're getting your content out to the right people at the right moment. So I want to show two examples of this at work. And this is an example of how social listening can help you capitalize on really important and trending conversations, although this one's maybe a little less important and a little more whimsical. It's a case study of Google and their travails in creating a hamburger emoji. And so in a tweet last year, an engineer from Denmark was wondering why Google's hamburger emoji put the cheese beneath the patty, while Apple's emoji put the cheese above the patty. And because this is a very important topic, it generated 20,000 retweets and thousands of replies on Twitter. And so Google noticed this, and its CEO responded sort of tongue-in-cheek, saying that we will drop everything and address this issue and make sure that people can agree on the correct way to do this. And it sparked headlines in the tech press, but it also reignited a debate about how emojis are designed and how the perspectives of engineers may actually influence our experience with technology. And they really capitalized this because their employees over the weekend continued engaging on Twitter and actually started testing different burgers in their office with cheese on the bottom and cheese on the top. And they came to what seems like a very scientific conclusion that the cheese should in fact be on the top. And so they changed the hamburger emoji in the next Android release. So this is a silly idea, and it doesn't actually lead to social impact and all the things that we aspire to. But it did generate a lot of conversation, and it was an example of how conversations can bubble up from these different social platforms and intersect with your issue or your brand. And there are opportunities to have conversations around that, whether they are somewhat silly or whether they are actually very serious. And another example that is a little bit more focused on social issues that we in the nonprofit communications field might be interested in is an example of Buffer, which is, you may know, as a tool that a company that creates social media management tools. And so way back in 2013, Buffer released their salary database to the public with limited fanfare. The intent of it was actually to show potential employees, and at that point they were growing really quickly, that they had a dedication to salary quality and transparency. Fast forward to 2015, and a conversation emerged around the hashtag TalkPay, stemming from a series of tweets that a female programmer in Silicon Valley sent about the discrepancy between her salary as a female programmer and the average salary of her male counterpart. And that's what sparked the TalkPay conversation. And Buffer saw this, and rather than be, very opportunistic and say, great point, we're really focused on this, we're doing a great job, they more focused on sharing resources with people who are having that conversation about how you can make sure that your company is being fair about its wages and its salaries, and actually, again, sharing a complete database of their employees' level of experience and the salaries of those employees, obviously removing their names. And so it could have stopped there, and it could have been something that, again, Buffer was doing mostly for its own purposes. But what they saw is that there's really interest in this topic, and there's a real lack of information on this topic, and it's leading to actual inequality among actual people. And so what they did in the subsequent years is really expand their efforts in organizational and corporate transparency, and actually created a hub Remember, this is a company that makes social media management tools. They have no incentive to necessarily do this, but they felt like it was really valuable for the industry, and especially in Silicon Valley, where there are still enormous disparities and gaps in salary equality and in pay. And so now if you go to open.buffer.com, there's a whole set of resources about not only how Buffer is opening up its company to the public, but how other companies can do it. And so they have a calculator to determine if you're a new employee, what level of equity are you entitled to. They have a series of books and philosophies that the leaders of the company are reading, and how those leaders are applying a lot of what they're learning to the actual corporate culture within Buffer. And so what they've really done is create this model and credibility around organizational transparency that they may not have done unless they were really listening to the conversations that were happening around this issue. So how can you do this? Well, one, you can plan to listen. So you may be able to see things that are on the horizon that are important to your organization, and you can start to listen to the things that people are saying around those issues, whether it's news events like elections, whether it's research releases, either your own or in the field, or whether it's just holidays or events that might be happening within your industry. Being able to think ahead, how can we anticipate what people are going to care about around these events and plan accordingly? But you can also listen to inform your planning. And so that involves finding relevant conversations that happen beyond your own platforms, figuring out the influencers and external audiences who are really talking substantively about your topics and how that can inform your messaging and your content, and also to use your knowledge to actually change what you craft and what you post to make sure that you're matching the message to the right moment. This can happen at different altitudes for your organization, and so this is just an example of how you might see something like the Me Too movement happening at different altitudes within the issue that we're focusing on. So there could be a local opportunity to be part of this conversation. There could be an industry-specific opportunity to be part of the conversation, and maybe your issue is elevated to the mainstream on a national level, and you want to find opportunities that are right for your organization to be able to capitalize on. So how do you decide when and how to weigh in on controversial and sensitive issues? Given the political landscape that we're in, we hear this a lot from organizations. Well, we could respond to everything that happens every hour, and then we wouldn't have time to do anything else. And so it's really important in advance to have some kind of criteria for when you're going to weigh in on something. So these are high-level guidance for what that criteria should be. You should figure out what's right for your organization. But one, is the issue central to your core mission? Two, are your audiences actively discussing an issue, or are only the people internally discussing it? And then the value of your message. Do you have something unique to contribute to the conversation? Everything that you do takes time, and so if you're going to try and respond to something in a way that is consistent with how hundreds of other organizations are responding, you have to really ask yourself, is this worth the time to do it if everyone else is doing the same thing? And so you have to really think about, can we add value? Can we be unique in this conversation rather than are we just doing the safe thing and doing what everybody else is doing? And there are also tools that you can use to support a lot of this work. This is just a sampling of those tools. And there's a lot more detail that you can do, detailed research you can do on your own. But a few examples. Obviously, trending topics, be able to actually have a system for reviewing trending topics, not just casually glancing at Twitter every now and then. Crowdsourced listening tools that can take tons and tons of input on social conversations and tell you the implications of that. Harken is an example. Good old-fashioned Google alerts, coming up with an actual process for not just receiving them, but doing something with them. Trending news feeds, influencers, and newsletters. So you might have your own newsletters, but newsletters around your issue or your industry can be really important to understanding what people are talking about. So that's how you can really use the amount of conversation and content that is out there to inform your work. And then the next thing we want to focus on is, what do you actually do with this, specifically as it pertains to the archive and the assets that you already have at your disposal? And really the lesson that we think is very simple but really critical to how the Atlantic does its work is that timeliness matters, timestamp doesn't. It's really important to be relevant and to be able to surface information and content at the time that people need it, but people are more and more trained to ignore the timestamp of that work. You know, think about how you consume information. You're constantly looking at feeds and streams. You don't have the time to think about when is this actually published, but you do have the time to think about, is this actually useful or interesting to me?
I will give you a testimonial on this. So literally in the last 3 weeks, when we redesigned comnetwork.org, one of the things we thought was really critical initially was when this was published. We wanted our content to be fresh and useful to people. We thought one way they could make a determination was to offer kind of a sell-by date. You know, people would be able to say, well, that was from November of 2017. It's not relevant to me in May. It turns out that our website, most, if not all the traffic we get are to things that we published 4 or 6 months back because people need it when they need it. And so we literally, in the last couple of weeks, I don't think we made any big deal about this, but we stripped all the timestamps off of things because we realized it wasn't relevant. What we might do is within the text at the bottom, note this was published on X date, so that people might be able to ask themselves, well, you know, it turns out MySpace is not a thing anymore. That's probably not going to be
You should also strip all references to MySpace.
Probably true. Probably true. Suffice to say, we really did recognize that this was in fact true, that timeliness matters and timestamp doesn't.
And like, look, if you're a breaking news organization or an organization that does, you know, focus on things that are happening in the moment, then that might not be realistic. But majority of organizations aren't that way, and we just know that audiences care less and less about when something was published unless it is, you know, breaking news or something that they're following on a minute-by-minute basis. Sean mentioned the statistic earlier. 57% of the Atlantic's traffic in a given month comes to articles not posted in that month. And so there's an internal, joke that I think has been beaten to death at this point. But the joke is that this statistic suggests that you could send all of the writers and editors home for a month and still get half of your traffic, so long as you keep the audience growth and development team in the office. And, you know, it's a corny joke, but it really is, when you think about it, I think illuminating in terms of how people actually get information now. Now, a large part of this is going to be search, which I'm sure a lot of you have complicated relationships with, and isn't necessarily something that you can predict or design for. But a lot of this is a concerted effort that is being made to make sure that things from our past are being resurfaced when they're most relevant. And this is probably the best example that we've seen internally of this, of how to resurface your best stories when your audiences need them most. So in February of 2015, we published a cover story called What ISIS Really Wants. And when it was originally published, it received 4 million unique visitors at that time. And then you can see there's a big drop-off in traffic to that piece. Then there's a big spike again in November of 2015, at which point 6.5 million unique visitors went to that article in that month. And the reason behind that is because, unfortunately, this was the Paris attacks, which ISIS quickly claimed. And, you know, what you can see here is that more people actually saw it the second time around than the first time around. So even if, in some strange world, all 4 million of those original visitors read it again, you still reached 2.5 million people who have never read this piece or maybe even never seen it. And we know that's obviously not the case. There are many more people within that 6.5 million who's not read it the first time. And there's a couple of lessons from this. One is that the Atlantic was not apologetic or opportunistic in doing this. They didn't say, you know, we're so sorry to have to resurface this story from 6 months ago, but here it is again, you know, sorry to clog up your feed. They said, you know, this is a tragedy, and, you know, to better understand the motivations behind the people who are behind this tragedy and this attack, check out this very well-reported piece that we published 9 months ago, and hopefully this helps you process and understand what's going on right now. And so you can't quite see probably in the slides, but, you know, there was no reference to the fact that this was published 9 months ago when they shared this on social media. And that's because people were really looking for answers at the time, and the Atlantic felt like they had some of those answers, or at least information that could help people process what was going on.
just a point of order here. Was this organic and then you guys jumped behind it? Or, so in other words, you saw people starting to share this. Someone said, I read something in the Atlantic. I feel like it's useful right now. I'm going to tweet it out to my friends or post it on Facebook or whatever it might have been. And then you guys thoughtfully and deliberately started to flood the zone with this article again? Or just take me through how that actually happened.
Yeah, so this was something that the audience development team, saw obviously what was breaking and immediately thought back to this piece and how it would have renewed relevance. And the reason they were able to do that is because they actively track the stories within the Atlantic's archives that may have renewed relevance. And unfortunately, a story about the motivations behind ISIS is not something that is going to have one-time relevance. And so that's something that they had flagged as being a story that could come back up because of news developments that might be happening. And so that was something that, they had initiated when the news broke.
So if you're a sexual violence organization, as a for instance, it may be that you put something out in the wake of the initial wave of Me Too, the Harvey Weinstein articles came out in the New Yorker and elsewhere. Clearly not the last time, unfortunately, that we're going to see that. Right. And so your advice might be to an organization like that, make sure you have those things at ready recall so that you're able to help an audience get it. Because I presume that what the audience here is looking for is clearly not breaking news. They're not looking for information about what happened in Paris, when, who was affected. What they want is context and a deeper dive and some analysis and a deeper understanding.
They're going to get the breaking news from a million other sources. And the Atlantic has had to make a decision about whether they wanted to compete with breaking news organizations or if they wanted to do what they're doing here, and I think that they do really well, even though I'm biased, which is like helping people contextualize and understand and connect the dots. And rather than try to do it all over again, they had this really well-reported, very previously successful piece that did all that. I think at the top of the article, they may have added an italicized paragraph that said, of course, we're very saddened by the recent Paris attacks. This was published in February and offers some context about the motivations here. So it wasn't that they completely ignored the fact that it had been previously published, but they weren't apologetic about it, and they weren't acting like every one of their readers has seen every one of their articles every time it's published. And I think that is kind of an important mindset to have.
I'll tell you, years ago, forgive me for folks who've heard me utter this phrase too many times, when I worked at CNN, we would frequently have conversations in the newsroom where someone would say, I think we should do a story on X or Y, and someone else inevitably, I'm not saying they were a hater, but they would jump up and say, we did that story 2 years ago, to which I would always say, I'm not sure that the people who saw that are still alive. And that's kind of running CNN joke about our demographics.
Right.
Suffice to say that what's old can be new again. Also, what you're suggesting here is quite interesting and probably worth remarking on, which is there's a big distinction and difference between a breaking news organization like the AP or maybe even NPR or New York Times, right? And longer form journalism, contextual journalism, magazine journalism like the Atlantic, and then organizations that are represented in the network, whether those could be foundations with deep expertise or think tanks or any number of other organizations who probably are not there minute to minute, but have the ability to offer deeper context or deeper understanding, some historical relevance, whatever it might be.
Right, and an expert perspective that even a really well-sourced, highly accomplished journalist may not be able to provide. I mean, this was written by Graham Wood, who is an incredible reporter on terrorism, foreign policy, etc. But even he is not necessarily going to be as steeped in a lot of these issues as an organization that only focuses on that issue, like a lot of the ones that are in the communications network. And so, even the most definitive magazine piece is still going to have holes, and even the most carefully, thoroughly covered issue is still going to have holes that maybe your organization can fill. And it may be a hole that you've already filled. And so that's kind of the key thing to keep in mind. So just some quick tips for how to actually operationalize this. One is just think about this from the inception point of your content. Actually create content for longer shelf life. So think about which angles will remain most relevant over time, not just what's new. And honestly, if you can avoid time stamping and referencing dates in your pieces that are not critical to either the accuracy or the narrative of that piece, think about pulling them out, thinking about removing them. I mean, there are probably pieces that you have in your archive that date themselves in the first 2 paragraphs, and you have to go back and think about, is that reference to that date necessary? And maybe you could pull it out and you'll give it much longer shelf life if people encounter it several months or years down the road. Do what The Atlantic does, which actually have a running bank that makes resurfacing really easy and frequent. They have a Google spreadsheet that has different categories, and they put links to articles in them by different categories, and some of them are identified and put in that spreadsheet because they're home runs and articles that get consistent perennial attention and engagement. And others are actually more tied to issues that might have renewed relevance over time. And so whenever there's a news development, or honestly, whenever they're looking to kind of fill a hole in their social posting, they're going to reference that spreadsheet, and they're going to find things that they can start to resurface in new context for new audiences. And then also, don't just post the same thing the same way over and over again. That actually will feel like spam to your audiences. So diversify how you frame the posts, diversify the messaging that you use around them, and always be thinking about what are people thinking about in this moment. And so it requires a little bit of editorial judgment rather than just putting links out the same way that you've put them out in the past.
So question for you for the pause here, which is, let's use the ISIS piece as an example. Was it simply a matter of, obviously the traffic spiked there, you get more viewers of that piece during the Paris attack than you did when it was originally published.
Yeah.
But did you also do a little bit of content creation? In other words, did you take pieces of that article and break them out into smaller pieces that were more I use the word shareable content, but shareable content?
Yes, and that's actually a really good point. I think what's not seen here is that there were a lot of supplemental assets to this piece that actually made this resurfacing much easier and more effective. So there were video interviews with Graham Wood, who wrote the piece, about his reporting process. There were maps that showed how the expansion of ISIS's presence in the Middle East, but also the different attacks that they've carried out over time. There was data and statistics that were shared. And so all of those then became assets that could be shared alone on different social channels. So you're not just asking someone to experience the 10,000 word piece or nothing. You're giving them different ways to come into the story. And those different assets have their own standalone value. And so The Atlantic's fine if you only look at that map and it gives you some useful information in contextualizing a certain incident or whatever. They're fine if you only experience that map. But ideally, that map would then make you interested in reading the full piece, and you can deepen your engagement that way. And so it's all about creating different ways for people to engage with the information and the content that isn't just a linear long-form experience.
It was a much more strategic approach, but it also suggests to me that you were able to place some of that content in places where people might be looking for breaking news and say, nothing's happened in the last 10 minutes, I keep refreshing my Twitter feed or whatever it might be, I'm going to take a deep dive now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that also gives you a diversity in the posts that you use to resurface this. And so it does feel fresh to people, even though it's the same content that continues to go out. Just to recap on some takeaways, and then love to take some questions from the group. Audience interest is unpredictable, and timing is a really key factor for engaging your audiences. The act of social listening can help you enter ongoing conversations with your audiences. Resurfacing offers the opportunity to point audiences to previously published content that's still relevant and valuable. And in order to operationalize all of this, you have to put processes in place. And so it can be as simple as just a running list of your highest performing pieces and your evergreen content that you can pull from when something happens or when you want to be able to offer your audiences value without creating something new. So really appreciate the time today and really excited to hear questions from the group and appreciate it.
Great. We have a number of questions. Let me start with Sarah, our friend out in Colorado. She says, I love this. I'd love to spend more time on resurfacing. The challenge that I run into is that a lot of the content that we have is really time sensitive. So bringing back a blog post that did great at the time but now contains outdated information about the current state of affairs doesn't seem like a good move. Any thoughts on how you might handle that?
So I don't know the ins and outs of your organization and the kind of content.
The Center for Health Progress.
Oh, great. So if there are ways, again, without sacrificing the accuracy or the value of the content, if there are ways to avoid some of those dated time references, I would think critically about opportunities to do that. Now, let's say that's not an option for you all. One way to think about this is rather than purely resurfacing, you might go back into your archives and create something new, but create something new that is more of a synthesis of different disparate past information that is newly relevant. So maybe there are 5 or 6 blog posts from your past that are time-stamped. If you resurface them, they would feel outdated. But within those 5 or 6 pieces, there's different pieces of information that you can bring together and connect the dots for your audiences so that they don't have to go read 5 or 6 pieces from your archive. And so that's not exactly resurfacing, but it is still trying to get more value out of what you've done in the past, rather than trying to come up with something wholly new to respond to every new moment.
Does this also, so I heard the word blog in Sarah's question, and I would think that my own bias when I hear the word blog is that it's of the moment. That, you know, we blogged something, we reacted, or we proactively sent something to the blog, and it's very much a matter of being timely. But I'm wondering if maybe that means that there has to be a little bit of a mind shift, which is the blog may actually be a place where you're in the moment pointing to something that's more evergreen, that report or whatever it might be. Or maybe there's content within that blog post. There's a map or a photograph or something that's less time sensitive than the opinion or commentary, whatever you might have offered in the moment that they're.
I have kind of radical opinions about this.
So please, let's hear some radical opinions. That's what we're among friends.
To me, a blog is just a container. It's just a place where we've decided content should live. And the amount of people who, one, are going to visit yourblog.com is small. And even smaller, the amount of people who might be interacting with your blog content in a Facebook feed, in a newsletter, in a Twitter feed, and make any connection about where it's published on your website. And so, honestly, I think, deliver the value in the moment, in the container that you're using for your content, but to ascribe some kind of meaning to, a blog post that doesn't exist for a normal article, I think is actually kind of antiquated. And so I would encourage, I'm a big believer in having a style and a voice to what you do, but I don't think that style and voice should be necessarily dependent on the channel that it lives on your website. But I know that's maybe a little bit of a radical opinion.
No. I think this is something we're all active learners here. So I think it's something we all have to be challenging the way we're thinking about things or approaching things. So Stephen asks, fantastic material so far. This is getting perhaps more into tools than strategy, but on the idea of social listening, I'd be interested to get your sense among the many options of the most critical tools or metrics for listening. All right, so Hearken is one, right? What else should you be?
The most critical tools and metrics is the question?
Let's go back to this. Let's see here. It was, critical tools and metrics.
Got it. So for tools, I'm not going to recommend specific branded tools. I would say where we found the most value is in tools that can take disparate pieces of information and make sense of them. And so those might be tools that kind of sit on top of social platforms and can take a lot of conversation and information that's happening around an issue and, give you some kind of reporting that helps make sense of that. And so, the reason I say that is if you're going to pay for a tool, that would be my benchmark for something you want to pay for.
Right.
If you feel like it's something that is really not adding value to what a human can do, I would question whether that's worth it. In terms of metrics, that's probably another webinar, right? I like to say two things. One is rather than focus on, your competitors or what other people are doing, really just focus on continuing improvement. Are you seeing year over year, month over month improvement in core metrics like engagement, like audience growth, like subscribers to your various platforms? But also know that those metrics that I just mentioned don't necessarily have any correlation to what you're trying to achieve as an organization, which is social impact or whatever it is that your goal is. And so don't use those top line, more superficial or like vanity metrics as a stand-in for, are we using communications, marketing, content to achieve our goals? That probably takes a much more specific, customized, tailored look at what you're trying to achieve and how you can make that connection between that impact and communications metrics. It's work that we do with clients. We help them set benchmarks that are more tied to their mission and their organizational and business goals, but it's not going to be one size fits all for every organization.
Yeah, I would say that, but speaking certainly for myself, the sense that I have, Stephen, is that for a lot of us, we're playing the long game. And so a lot of the interventions that you want to make aren't going to necessarily reveal themselves from a month-to-month metrics look. And that you need to be probably thinking about having a deep understanding of wherever your organization might be, what are the narratives that are driving the conversation on that issue? And are those narratives that you want to perpetuate, or are those narratives you want to disrupt? And then thinking about how you can put content out there that's going to help to shape a narrative that you think is going to be constructive and positive and useful to your organization, and then listening to hear when those narratives arrive, because the interesting thing about the work that we're all doing in the social sector is almost inevitably the kettle is on somewhere. Someone's boiling some water on your issue in some part of the world, and being able to tap in and listen to that audience, which is frequently influential. They're not taking days off from this stuff to chase whatever the thing is that's preoccupying Twitter. Understanding when there's spikes of intensity or interest among that core audience is really a place you probably want to focus some of your efforts.
I want to just double down on one of those points you made, Sean, like the point that somewhere someone is talking about your issue or is interested in learning about your issue. And I think it's really important that whether or not people quote-unquote care about what you do should not be gauged by just what you're getting from the people that you know closest. And these tools that we have at our disposal, they work both ways, right? We've seen how they can be used for evil, but you can also really use them to find people who really want to engage with an issue that you might be focused on and don't know how, or looking for guidance or looking for information. And these tools can be used to do that. And so I think it's important to note that, like to Sean's point, there are always people out there that are going to care, but there's not always going to be the same people that you're used to engaging. So I think that's a really good point.
All right, Jason has a question. Institutional bias is hard to break. So in my organization, we're trying to pivot away from the ideas that many people in our general audience think about us so we can attract new audiences. And we're trying to refocus on new ideas, but those ideas are coming from the institution, us, and don't always fit what our audience is chatting about in our sphere. We still need to feed them all. Any off-the-cuff advice?
So being able to feed some of your core audiences while also still serving aspirational.
Yeah, I like to think about this as like, this is a great question if you'll allow me to use the metaphor of my kids. My wife and I are trying to feed them the broccoli, and they're determined to have the French fries. Right? Guess what? We're probably going to give them some French fries along with the broccoli.
Right. I mean, one thing, not everyone has the resources to do this, but you also don't need to do this in an incredibly formal way either. I still think that things like audience personas and audience typologies are hugely important for an organization to have.
Because explain what those are, kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the idea of actually segmenting your audiences and thinking about within those segments, what do they care about? What are their motivations? One of the things that we really focus on when we develop audience personas and typologies is we really move away from their quote-unquote hard identity, which is like their job title and their demographics, and we actually focus much more on their needs and their soft identities, which is what motivates them, and also their information consumption habits. So we actually, when we do personas and typologies, we do not have like, Sally the physician. We actually focus much more on what is the information needs of that person. And so being able to actually articulate that, whether or not it's done with the gold standard of research or evidence, but being able to articulate who those different audiences are from on a spectrum of core to aspirational and what you want to be able to, what they want and how you can provide something of value to them, I think is really important. And I think, when you think about reaching the aspirational audiences, so outside of the typical folks, it just requires like some work in going and listening to them. And so, I'll give a plug to an organization that we work with, the Colorado Health Foundation. They've been really focused, you might have seen their presentation at last year's ComNet, they've been really focused on getting outside of the traditional audiences that they reach. And so they went out on the road in Colorado and visited dozens of communities, and with a specific focus on just going and asking questions of people that they did not typically reach as a foundation, whether it's school teachers, whether it's the fire chief, anyone who might have a unexpected impact on community health outcomes that they just weren't reaching, and just hear what they have to say and put yourself in more of a listening role. This can happen IRL. It doesn't all have to happen on social platforms. And so
IRL is in real life for those of you who
thank you for that annotation.
Well, we're in Washington, so everybody speaks that.
That's right, you're right.
Taryn and Karen, just plus one to that. Taryn and Karen have done some really extraordinary work, and I don't mean to blow up Taryn for its email, but she's a very generous person. If you want to learn more about what they did, I expect she'd be happy to hear from you. If you're a network member, you can find her through directory. Let me get to a couple more before we run out of time here. So Wendy asks, hi, wondering if you have any best practices or guidance on how and when to engage influencers for amplification purposes. That's a broad question.
Yeah, there's also a separate webinar subject, but some quick stuff. One is really think about what are they getting out of this. Out of this situation. So rather than just asking someone purely to promote your work, if you understand who that influencer is, you understand their connection to the issue that you might have in common, think about what might be valuable to them. So it could be like, hey, here's some really interesting data that I think supports a lot of what you're communicating to your own audiences, and you might want to work this into the information that you provide to them. Or you should really check out this story that we just found from this really inspiring person. I think your audience would find this really interesting.
The coin of the realm in social is people want to sound smart.
Yeah.
And so if you can go to somebody that, whoever that person might be, is influential or has lots of followers or whatever, unless they're getting paid to tweet, and that happens, right?
Yeah.
Chances are they're going to appreciate someone who's pointing them to information that's going to make them a deeper, better thinker and learner and doer.
It's very hard to sound smart like every 10 minutes. And so if you can help,
I'm lucky if it happens once a day.
So if you can help them do that, it's a great one. You can help them do that, then I think they're going to be more likely to engage.
Okay, so Lori asks, and I think this has to be our last question. I work for a venture philanthropy that invests in social enterprise businesses that helps opportunity, youth, and people with high employment barriers, histories of incarceration, homelessness, mental illness, substance abuse, etc., get into the workforce and succeed. Lori's organization is incredible in this way. The more activist-oriented program staff want us and our executive director to have a stronger voice on issues in the news related to our target population. That's a lot of issues to potentially weigh in on. On top of that, our board and our founder are on the conservative side, so our organizational niche is decidedly nonpartisan. We see our work as something everyone can get behind, but it's awfully hard to have something with say while at the same time satisfying the program staff, but also not alienating our donors and board and founder. So beyond the points you made in your slide, any advice on this conundrum? So this is the staff is here, and the board is there, and we still want to be influential and active and useful and valuable to people. So despite, I think, what we've probably the conversation we've been having as a country for the last 18 or 24 months or whatever it is, like facts, the old days of Patrick Moynihan, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you aren't entitled to your own facts. Right. To the extent that you can be a broker, an honest broker of factual information, I frankly think you're speaking for myself, Lori, I think you're in a wonderful position.
Yeah.
There are many organizations that have blinders on because they are talking to themselves and to people who think like them. And the fact that there's this necessary tension that exists within your organization is a strength and not a weakness. And so I would figure out how to make a virtue into a vice and figure out you actually probably know a lot more about these issues because you have the luxury of listening to a staff that's in one spot and a board that's in another, and they could probably teach each other something.
100% agree. I mean, what you're describing, Lori, is in a very succinct manner like a challenge that the majority of the organizations that we talk to and work with have been dealing with over the last 18 months or so. And I would say +1 to everything Sean said. And then I would go back to the earlier slide about, and there's more to that, about have a criteria, and it's going to take a lot of internal conversations to figure out what that criteria is, but have a criteria for why, what are we going to weigh in on and why? And you're probably going to piss some people off in doing that, but if you can agree on a criteria, then at least you have a rationale and a process for making these decisions, and I think that's the biggest step. Have a rationale and a process so that you're not making every decision in the moment in a reactive way, and in a way that then only favors the loudest voice in the room.
Right. And strategy is often about what you say no to.
Yeah.
Right? So if you can declare there's 115 things we're not going to talk about, and there are 3 that we're going to weigh in on anytime they erupt, you're also going to go a little less crazy in the comm shop because you're going to have great clarity and offer better strategic services to everybody, whether it's on the board side or the staff side.
Yeah.
I think we probably need to leave it there. I'm sorry if we left anyone behind. Jason is on Twitter, and so you can find him at @jtomassini, spelled like it sounds. If you don't speak Italian, that's what Google's for. Jason Tomassini, Google him on the Atlantic and Twitter, and you'll find it. Grateful to have you all with us. We will be back not too long from now, but if you would in the meantime, before we hang up on you, would you please take the survey that pops up when you sign up? Because we need your feedback in order to get better. And my huge debt of gratitude and thanks to Jason for doing such a wonderful job and sharing so much great information with all of us. We're deeply grateful.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Please stand by.